Hello, my friends. I hope you're doing well today and welcome back to our ProRevenge channel, where in today's episode you'll hear one story about how OP takes down her shift supervisor who treats her and many other employees like garbage. Guys, I love this story. I don't want to give away too much, so all I have to say is it's a pretty long story, so make sure you have some time to listen to the whole thing. I hope you stay for the story today and be sure to hit that subscribe button for future revenge stories. Let's get into it. I work as a computer technician now, but when I was in college, I worked part-time at a well-known chain cafe. Let's call it Seattle's finest. Other than babysitting or under-the-table work helping at a friend's booth at Renaissance fairs, it was my first job. The manager, Eliza, had aspirations for rising in the company at a corporate level, so she was obsessed with making our store the finest, Seattle's finest. At the same time, though, she wasn't an especially effective manager at the store level. She didn't really know how to make all the drinks and had to constantly refer to the recipe cards, even though she was supposed to be an expert on everything and the leader of our store. She also didn't really care to learn, which meant that during a particularly busy rush, she could never step in to help us out in making drink orders. She would basically just hide in her office in the back near the kitchen. However, she had a college degree, and our company's policy, at least at the time, was that only college degree holders could be the full manager of a store. She left the day-to-day running of the store to Stephen, the lead shift supervisor who had been working at that location for 25 years since he was 16. He always said that the only reason he wasn't manager and not running the store was that he didn't have a college degree. He would always remind all the workers that the store would run into the ground if he wasn't around. Stephen didn't really have to do much other than delegate others to do things, make sure orders were sent out to suppliers, and sign those orders when they arrived. Our store followed the standard company practice, so a fixed amount of supplies was usually ordered in every day, with only slight variations to account for a particular store's needs. For example, we might order 60 chocolate muffins a day, while the company average is 100 because our store is next to a yoga studio, and the ladies who came in ordered less of the fattening junk items. Steve also wrote the schedule every week. When I was hired, Eliza was the one who interviewed me, and she assured me that I'd get at least 20 hours a week for our shifts to coincide with my school schedule, and I only worked Saturdays on the weekend, not Sundays. During my 2-week training period, she kept her word. I'd hover around 18 to 22 hours a week for 4.5 hours at a time. After that, however, since I was fully trained, she passed me over to Stephen. Stephen followed Eliza's pattern for a week or so, but soon he began trying to schedule me in the mornings, which I couldn't do because of school. He'd pretend to get really angry and disappointed and talk about how, in his 25 years with the company, one of the first things you learn is to be a team player. Well, Stephen, I do want to be a team player, but I'm not going to drop my schooling that'll lead to a career to work part-time at a coffee shop. That's great, but I still couldn't work in the mornings. So, he'd grumble and say, I'll have to talk to Eliza to see what we can do about you. Eliza would only occasionally show up at the store. Usually, she was there mid-morning and left well before closing. And Steve would always open the store, and of course he'd say things like, I've been opening the store for more than 20 years, blah blah blah. Stephen would also try to suck up to customers at the same time and condescend to us in front of them, saying things like, forgive her, she's new, and you see what I have to work with? Raw recruits, ah! Sometimes he'd outright call us knuckleheads if we couldn't clean things up fast enough or make drinks quickly enough. Like, he'd be hanging out in the back, counting boxes, meanwhile it's 12 noon on a Saturday, and I'm running the register, making all the drinks, and our line is 10 people deep. And he sent his other worker off to lunch and refuses to help, saying, you've got to have your baptism of fire. Everybody needs to learn to work under pressure. He took himself way too seriously. He thought he was special because he spoke fluent Spanish. Since he worked in the morning, a lot of people who had early morning jobs would come in, and many of them spoke Spanish only. And he thought it was his specialty that he could communicate with them. Well, my father's from Spain, and I happen to speak fluent Spanish myself, so one Saturday when I opened the store with him I started speaking Spanish to one of the customers, and the customer complimented me on how well I spoke the language. Steve looked like he was ready to murder me. Whenever customers would come in who spoke Spanish, rather than letting me communicate with them, Steve would get off his rear and say, I'll handle this. As time went on, Steve would only schedule me for 8 hours a week in the worst shifts possible, like closing Friday night and immediately opening Saturday morning. I thought, whatever, I'll just start applying to other jobs, but I didn't tell him that, though I knew he was giving all the hours to his favorites, which were usually the young women he tried to flirt with. I know this because he tried the same thing with me at first. He said he could give me more hours, but I had to play ball. Nothing that I could actually prove in court, but he was hinting that if I went out with him, he would give me more hours. Like, no thanks, man, you're gross, old, and married. Well, Eliza was up for a promotion to district manager, which meant she would oversee 5 or 6 of Seattle's finest coffee shops instead of just one. However, in a whole team meeting one special Sunday, she said that our store consistently was losing product. She warned us to stop giving discounts to friends, stop giving away free cookies or snacks to friends, and so on. She also said that if we planned to have some of the pastries ourselves, which we were allowed to do during our shifts, we had to make sure to write it down on the store use board. At least during the hours I worked, I've never witnessed anyone giving away free product, and I certainly wasn't using any of it myself. No one gave stuff away, other than Steve. Steve got a bonus every time the store use board was below a certain threshold, and he would always accuse us of stealing or giving away things. In fact, he said so at the meeting, and I quote, "Shrinkage is caused by these rookies who think a company runs on 100% profit. It's a business based on cold money, and we're bleeding it when we steal products or give it away. You guys need to stop doing that." Meanwhile, I always noticed Steve giving free discounts to certain customers and giving things away. One of those rules for thee, not me types of things. Another worker actually asked him about it, and he said, "Managers have certain privileges, like, dude, you're not a manager. You make $3 more an hour than me, and you've spent your whole life here." Steve also resented the fact that most of us who worked in the store were college students who would eventually move on someday to something hopefully more financially profitable. Steve would do this working-class hero bit where he would talk about how college people were snobs, didn't know how to do real work, were lazy and privileged, and contributed nothing to society. He also mocked me for majoring in computing as a female and accused me of just trying to get my Mrs. degree. He acted like he was kidding, but he was still really slimy. Then he went back to talking about himself and how business people's whole day would collapse without people like him to get them started the right way with coffee, saying, "I am as indispensable to a large corporation as the CEO. People need their coffee, and they can't start their day without a good cup of coffee." Meanwhile, we're all thinking, calm down, Steve. You're a shift supervisor at a suburban coffee shop, and you wear an apron with your name embroidered on it. You're not curing cancer. Anyway, Eliza's promotion depended on our store reducing its shrinkage. On a date a few days from our Sunday meeting, company bigwigs would come to the store and check out how well Eliza ran things. We were told to look sharp. The bigwigs would be in the dining room chatting with Eliza, while the rest of us who were scheduled that day tried to look our best. Steve didn't really have an incentive to make Eliza look good because, as long as he kept overall shrinkage beneath a certain number, he would still get his bonus. But that threshold was too high for Eliza to earn her promotion. Also, it wasn't as if Steve would become manager if Eliza got promoted. The company would simply get a new manager as an outside hire. Informally, we'd call Steve assistant manager, but the company did not officially recognize him in this capacity. Since he was a long-time worker and worked full-time, he did get health benefits and a 2-week vacation. The rest of us, lowly part-timers, just got a store discount and some free food or drink while working. We got paid every 2 weeks, and we got tips every single week. If you've ever worked at a coffee shop like Seattle's finest, customers would throw money into a jar at the register if they felt like being generous. The tips would be emptied out every night, and eventually at the end of the week, all the money would be parceled out to the workers depending on the hours they worked. Since I only worked a few hours, my tips were small, but at least it paid for laundry. My school starts a couple of hours after the store opens, and since I wasn't burning too much energy working, I'd get up nice and early every day. The store was close to my apartment, and I always walked there. It was the time of the year when the moon was still out early in the morning. I decided that I'd walk to the store and get my tips for the week. My walk to work has me approaching in the direction of the alley entrance, but I intended to enter through the front. Store policy was that you could only enter the back way if you were scheduled to work. As usual, at that hour, our daily supply truck was pulling out of the alley, and there was a huge stack of daily supplies in crates outside the back door. Steve propped open the back door with a trash can and was carrying one crate at a time into the store's back room. My first instinct was to help him, but then I remembered I wasn't being paid that day, and besides, I don't like Steve. I was fascinated watching him as he worked because usually he's so lazy. I was behind cars and trees so he couldn't see me. He stopped working, but there was still a crate left at the back door. It was filled with what looked to be desserts, bags of coffee, and random boxes of granola bars. In addition to coffees and pastries, our store also sold third-party nutrition bars, the kind where you can buy a box of 6 for $4 at the grocery store, but we charge you $2.99 for one. He was still talking on his cell phone, and only a minute or two later a beat-up car pulls into the alley. The driver pops the trunk, and Steve puts the crate into the car, and the car speeds off. Steve then goes back into the store. At first I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a work-related thing that I didn't understand because I wasn't a shift supervisor. Maybe the person in the car was from another store, and our store was supposed to be sending those items to them. I decided to forget my tips for the time being and walked back home. By the time I got there, I realized it was most likely that Steve was a thief. I went to school and forgot about it for a few hours, but every now and then during the day, I thought about it again. The next morning, I woke up and made sure I had my cell phone ready. I waited outside really early, even before the supply truck came. When it did come, sure enough, Steve did the same song and dance as the day before. He left one crate outside, called his accomplice on the phone, and the same car arrived and pulled away after Steve packed its trunk with stolen goodies. I actually worked that day because it was a Saturday. Steve was his usual jerk self, but hearing him banter with customers reminded me of other pieces of conversation that I overheard from him over the past many weeks. Steve had a side business, or at least his wife did, selling snacks outside of clubs and sporting events. I put two and two together and realized that if Steve stole even one crate and sold off its items at a massive discount, he'd still make a pretty penny, and all of it was profit. And he'd stolen a crate 2 days in a row. Who knows how many more crates he'd stolen in the past. I realized that if I told Eliza, she wouldn't believe me, and Steve would deny it. I had to catch him repeatedly doing it over and over again to make my case that it wasn't a one-time thing, which Steve would most likely try to argue. I decided to record Steve for multiple days to make sure my suspicions were correct before I accused him of anything. And that was precisely what I did. Staking out Steve stealing became my morning ritual for a week. Out of the 4 days, he stole the crate 3 times, and each time I had him recorded. Now, all I needed to do was show Eliza on my phone, and I'd nail this jerk. I was just about to call her, but then I remembered that big company meeting regarding Eliza's promotion was coming up that Monday afternoon, just a couple of days later. I wasn't scheduled to work, but I knew I could talk my way into the back room with an excuse that I needed my check. Our back room has a computer where we clock in and out. It's just one window on the screen. If you click out of it, you have access to the rest of the computer's functions. One thing the computer always has running in the background is what we call Store TV. It was basically just a series of short infomercials about how wonderful Seattle's finest coffee was, how our beans are from plantations where workers are treated humanely, how we donate to underprivileged communities, things like that. The file was stored as a WMV file, and the store just played it on a continuous loop. Every so often, Eliza would obtain a new set of infomercials, and we'd loop those out. Our store had one big screen mounted from the ceiling, which faced out into the store, away from the registers. My plan, obviously, was to upload my video of Steve stealing onto the store computer and play it on the TV. I had the files, which I combined at home into one big file of 3 occasions, where you could clearly see his face and the face of the woman driving the car, who I assume is his wife, and how they're clearly stealing the product from the store. Eliza and the big bosses were already there at the restaurant, so the sensible thing to do would be for me to say, "Excuse me, Eliza," and then brazenly interrupt their meeting with my cell phone video held up to her face. But I love a bit of drama, and Steve had this coming. So, I see Eliza with her colleagues sitting at a table near the registers, where Steve is standing with a giant kiss-up grin on his face. The store isn't really crowded. Eliza sees me when I come in, and, in full I love my staff mode, says, "Oh everyone, here's Opie, one of our newest and best. She's going to college for computing," followed by a bunch of nods and oohs and ahs, pretending to give a hoot. I smile and mouth the words, "I'm just here to get my tips." "Oh, of course, Opie." And Steve looks like he wants to slap me, but too bad. "I'm going into the back room, you jerk." Our tips are placed in little baggies labeled with the amounts in our cubbies in the back room, with an honor system not to go grabbing anyone else's tips. I grab my tips, which is $11.50. Not bad. But I go straight for the computer. I have my phone's USB cable, and I plug it into the USB port of the store computer. I upload the file as planned, unclick the propaganda channel for Seattle's finest, and switch it to Steve the Thief and set the video for a continuous loop. I came out into the restaurant, and as usual, no one really cares about the TV. I go to Steve and order a hot latte. Steve looks like he doesn't want me there at all, but he still has a grin on his face because the bosses are there. He doesn't know that, just a few feet above his head, there's a continuous loop of him and his wife stealing product in the alley every morning. I had made sure to include a time and date stamp on the videos when editing. He already had some hot milk ready, and all he had to do was put 2 espresso shots. I had my drink in 30 seconds. I pulled out my wallet, but uncharacteristically he smiled at me and waved me off. Eliza saw me and nodded in approval. Then I sat at a table not far from where the bosses were sitting. Above Steve's head, his video was playing silently. I sat and watched my master creation like it was a big movie premiere starring Steve, with a giant grin on my face. It didn't take long until one of the bosses said, "Eliza, that isn't our company video playing on the TV." "What's that?" Eliza looks at the video. Everyone else looks at the video, mouths agape. Only Steve is still standing at the register, smiling and grinning like a ninny. He hasn't turned around to look at the TV above his head yet. Finally, Eliza says, "Steve, can you explain what's going on here?" Steve looks at the video and, for a second, looks like he was going to implode. He didn't say or do anything other than go into the back room. Seconds later, the video stopped, and a few moments later, it began playing again. "Huh, Steve, I got you again. See, I deleted the correct video on the computer and made a duplicate of your video and renamed it as if it were the original video." So, everyone in the dining room was once again treated to a loop of Steve and his wife stealing entire crates of designer granola bars and pastries repeatedly. One of the bosses said, "Eliza, let's close the store right now. We need to deal with this." He pointed me to the door, and who am I to argue, sir? I happily walked home with $11.50, but it felt like $1,000,000. A couple of days later, I get a call from corporate thanking me for the information about Steve. And anyways, as thanks, a week later, I received $200 in store credit. A few days later, I come in to find neither Eliza nor Steve at the restaurant. One of my coworkers told me that she heard that Steve was arrested for theft and charged on top of being immediately fired. Eliza got her promotion because it was proven that the only reason her store had moderately high shrinkage was because Steve was stealing. However, because she was supposed to be keeping a close eye on Steve, she's being watched carefully to ensure she's actually a good employee. Well, that's fair. She wasn't a thief, but she should have kept a closer watch on her store. I absolutely loved this story. As for me, the new manager got my final check because I quit. As time went on and I graduated school, I did eventually learn that Steve was not only stealing product, but was also embezzling tips and tampering with the time clock to reduce people's hours and to give himself more. He went to jail for 6 years, but his wife got a suspended sentence because they had 2 children under the age of 13. I learned this because the company I worked for did tech service for Seattle's finest corporate office, where Eliza now works. She remembered me, and over the finest coffee in all Seattle, she told me the whole story. This story is a compelling tale of workplace dynamics, betrayal, and justice served with a side of cleverness. I found it engaging due to its vivid portrayal of flawed characters like Eliza and Steve, who embody real-world workplace frustrations. Eliza's incompetence as a manager, hiding in her office while leaving the store to Steve, highlights a common issue of unqualified leadership propped up by arbitrary credentials like a college degree. It's frustrating yet relatable, as many have encountered managers who prioritize corporate ambitions over hands-on leadership. Steve, however, steals the show as the quintessential self-important supervisor. His arrogance, hypocrisy, and petty power plays, like manipulating schedules to favor his favorites or flirting for leverage, are infuriating but authentic. His theft of supplies, paired with his sanctimonious rants about shrinkage, paints him as a classic workplace villain. The narrator's decision to catch him in the act with video evidence is satisfyingly proactive, showcasing resourcefulness and a knack for dramatic flair. Swapping the store's promotional video for a loop of Steve's crimes is a bold, almost cinematic move that delivers a gratifying payoff. The story also subtly critiques corporate structures, like the degree requirement for management, which sidelines Steve despite his experience, though his actions justify the oversight. The resolution, with Steve's arrest and Eliza's scrutinized promotion, feels just, though I wish the narrator's role in exposing Steve had been more formally recognized beyond store credit. Overall, it's a well-crafted narrative that balances workplace realism with a triumphant underdog victory, leaving me both entertained and reflective about fairness and accountability in professional settings. And that wraps up another episode of our ProRevenge channel. If you guys enjoyed that story, hit the thumbs up. If you aren't subscribed, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future revenge stories. And I'll see you guys in the next one!